The notification appeared on Detective Amy Rodriguez's computer screen at exactly 2:47 p.m. on a grey Thursday afternoon in March 2024. After 18 years working cold cases for the Illinois State Police, she had learned to recognize the weight of certain moments before they fully registered in her conscious mind. The CODIS database match had been sitting in her inbox for less than 3 minutes, but something about the case number made her pause. Henderson, Sarah Michelle. Missing since September 12, 1968. File last updated 2019. Rodriguez leaned back in her chair, the fluorescent lights of the Springfield headquarters casting harsh shadows across the manila folders that perpetually cluttered her desk. 56 years. She had worked cases that stretched back decades, but nothing quite like this. In 1968, DNA was still a theoretical concept locked away in university laboratories. The double helix had been decoded, but the idea that microscopic genetic material could solve crimes belonged to science fiction. Yet here, on her monitor, was irrefutable proof that Thomas James Carlisle's DNA matched biological evidence collected from a 16-year-old girl's torn sweater in rural Millbrook, Illinois, more than half a century ago. The match shouldn't have been possible. Carlisle had died 6 years earlier, in 2018. His saliva collected during a routine arrest for domestic violence in Kane County. His genetic profile had been entered into the system posthumously when Illinois expanded its DNA collection protocols. The Henderson evidence had been digitized only in 2023, part of a massive cold case initiative that processed thousands of forgotten samples using new extraction techniques that could recover genetic material from fibers, fabric fragments, and microscopic traces that previous technology couldn't detect. Rodriguez pulled up Sarah Henderson's file, watching the black and white photographs load with agonizing slowness on her outdated system. A young face stared back at her from a school portrait taken just weeks before the disappearance. Sarah had been a junior at Millbrook High School, honor roll student, daughter of wheat farmers Margaret and Robert Henderson. She had vanished on a Tuesday morning, riding her bicycle to school along the same rural route she had taken every day for 3 years. If you're following this investigation and want to see how modern forensic techniques are solving cases that seemed impossible to crack, subscribe to stay updated on breakthrough discoveries that are changing everything we thought we knew about cold cases. The original investigation file was thicker than most from that era, nearly 4 inches of reports, witness statements, and search documentation. Sheriff Douglas Walsh had been thorough by 1968 standards, but the tools available to him were primitive compared to modern forensic capabilities. No cell phone records to trace, no security cameras to review, no social media footprints to follow. Just physical evidence, witness testimony, and intuition. Rodriguez found herself staring at the evidence inventory list, typed on an old manual typewriter with letters that struck unevenly against the paper. Item 7. Female's sweater, blue cardigan, torn at left shoulder, unknown fiber samples collected. Item 8. Fabric fragments. Location, northwest corner of Bramwell Road and County Line 4, collected in evidence bags 8A through 8D. What struck her was not what was listed, but what the original investigators couldn't have known they were looking at. Those unknown fiber samples contained genetic material that would remain undetectable for another 25 years. The fabric fragments held traces of skin cells that would become the key to solving Sarah Henderson's disappearance, but only after technologies that didn't exist in 1968 could finally read the story written in molecules invisible to the human eye. Margaret Henderson woke that Tuesday morning to the sound of her husband Robert's boots on the kitchen linoleum below. The September air carried the scent of turning leaves and harvest dust through the open bedroom window of their 2-story farmhouse, located 3 miles east of Millbrook on what locals simply called Henderson Road. The gravel driveway stretched nearly a quarter-mile from the house to the main road, lined with oak trees that Robert's grandfather had planted in 1923. Everything about that morning would later be dissected, analyzed, and remembered with the painful precision that comes only after normal moments become evidence in an investigation. Sarah had been unusually quiet during breakfast, picking at the scrambled eggs and bacon that Margaret had prepared the same way every school morning for 3 years. At 16, Sarah was developing the contemplative nature that often accompanies the transition from childhood to adulthood, but something about her demeanor that morning struck Margaret as different. When pressed years later by investigators, Margaret would describe it as a kind of distant thoughtfulness, as if Sarah was working through something important in her mind. She wore her favorite blue cardigan over a white blouse, the same outfit she had chosen for school pictures the previous week. The bicycle ride to Millbrook High School should have taken Sarah exactly 18 minutes. She had timed it herself during her freshman year, pedaling the winding rural route that connected their farm to the small town center where the school sat adjacent to the grain elevator and the Lutheran church. The route took her along Henderson Road to the intersection with Bramwell Road, then southwest for 2 miles before turning north on County Line 4. It was a journey she had made hundreds of times, through spring rains and winter snow, past the Morrison farm with its red barn that needed painting, beyond the old Carlisle property with its collapsed silo, and finally into town, where the trees gave way to sidewalks and the rural silence yielded to the sounds of small-town morning routines. Robert Henderson kissed his daughter goodbye at 7:23 a.m., noting the time because he had been listening to the Grain Futures report on WLS radio. Sarah wheeled her bicycle, a blue Schwinn Breeze that her parents had given her for her 15th birthday, from the garage where it was stored each night. Margaret watched from the kitchen window as Sarah pedaled down the long driveway, her blonde hair catching the early morning sunlight. That image would become Margaret's most treasured and most torturous memory, her daughter disappearing around the bend in the oak-lined driveway, one hand raised in a casual wave, completely unaware that she was riding toward an encounter that would define the rest of her short life. The first indication that something was wrong came at 8:15 a.m., when Sarah's homeroom teacher, Mrs. Patricia Dobson, marked her absent. Sarah had missed only 3 days of school in her entire academic career, all due to documented illnesses, and had never been late without prior notification. When Sarah failed to appear for second-period English, Mrs. Dobson called the main office. By 10:30 a.m., Principal William Fraser had called the Henderson farm. Margaret answered the phone while kneading bread dough, flour still coating her hands, when she learned that her daughter had never arrived at school. The bicycle was discovered at 11:47 a.m. by Dale Morrison, whose farm bordered the route Sarah took to school. Morrison had been checking fence lines along Bramwell Road when he spotted the blue Schwinn lying on its side in the tall grass near the intersection with County Line 4. The bicycle was undamaged, its chain properly engaged, its tires properly inflated. Sarah's school books remained neatly arranged in the wire basket attached to the handlebars. Algebra textbook, English literature anthology, spiral notebook with her neat cursive handwriting visible through the metal mesh. Her lunch, packed by Margaret in a brown paper bag, sat beside the books. The apple still crisp, the sandwich still fresh enough that it could have been placed there minutes earlier. Sheriff Douglas Walsh had been preparing for retirement when Sarah Henderson disappeared. At 58 years old, he had spent 32 years maintaining law and order in McLean County's rural communities, dealing primarily with property disputes, occasional domestic disturbances, and the predictable troubles that came with farming communities and seasonal workers. Nothing in his experience had prepared him for a missing child case, especially not one that would quickly escalate beyond the capabilities of his small department. The initial search began within hours of Dale Morrison's discovery of Sarah's abandoned bicycle. Walsh assembled every available resource in McLean County, His 3 full-time deputies, the volunteer fire department, and the civil defense volunteers, who typically assisted during tornado seasons and flooding emergencies. By 2 p.m. on September 12th, nearly 60 people were combing the area around Bramwell Road and County Line 4, working in systematic grid patterns that Walsh had learned during his brief military service in Korea. The terrain made searching both easier and more challenging than urban investigations. The flat farmland offered clear sightlines for miles, but the late summer corn stood nearly 8 feet tall, creating a maze of narrow pathways where a person could disappear just yards from the main road. The searchers called Sarah's name continuously, their voices carrying across the September afternoon air, mixing with the sounds of rustling corn stalks and the distant rumble of harvest equipment. Margaret Henderson insisted on joining the search, despite Walsh's gentle suggestions that she remain at home near the telephone, and her anguished calls for her daughter created a haunting soundtrack that would remain in searchers' memories for decades. As the sun began to set on that first day, Walsh made the decision to contact the Illinois State Police. The case had moved beyond his department's capabilities, and he knew that time was critical in missing person investigations. State Police Detective Lieutenant Frank Kowalski arrived from Springfield at 9:30 p.m., bringing with him crime scene technicians and bloodhounds borrowed from the Department of Corrections. The dogs picked up Sarah's scent from her bedroom and followed it along her bicycle route, confirming the path to where the bicycle was found, but losing the trail at the intersection where the bike had been discovered. The FBI's involvement came on the 3rd day, when Special Agent Richard Barnes opened a federal investigation under the assumption that Sarah might have been transported across state lines. Barnes was a methodical investigator who had worked several kidnapping cases in Chicago, but the rural setting and lack of witnesses presented unique challenges. He established a command post in the Millbrook Fire Station, installing multiple telephone lines and coordinating with law enforcement agencies across Illinois, Indiana, and Iowa. The search expanded to include nearly 300 volunteers at its peak, drawing people from surrounding counties who had heard about Sarah's disappearance on radio stations broadcasting from Peoria and Bloomington. Farmers suspended their harvest work to join the effort, using their knowledge of local terrain to guide searchers through creek beds, abandoned farm buildings, and wooded areas that outsiders might overlook. The Morrison family provided hot coffee and sandwiches from their kitchen, while the Lutheran Church organized meal rotations for the searchers and the Henderson family. Walsh documented everything meticulously, filling out reports in his careful handwriting and photographing potential evidence with the department's aging Polaroid camera. Every discarded cigarette butt, every tire track in the soft earth near the roadside, every piece of torn fabric caught on fence wire was collected and catalogued. Most would prove irrelevant, but Walsh understood that missing details could mean the difference between solving a case and watching it fade into the archives of unsolved mysteries. By the end of September, the intensive search had covered over 40 square miles. The FBI had interviewed more than 200 people, including every male resident between the ages of 16 and 60 within a 10-mile radius of where Sarah's bicycle was found. They had checked the backgrounds of recent parolees, transient workers who had been in the area during harvest season, and anyone with a history of contact with minors. But as October arrived and the corn was harvested, revealing fields that held no trace of Sarah Henderson, the investigation began its inevitable transition from active search to cold case file. Margaret Henderson's obsession began with small rituals that seemed reasonable to a grieving mother. She kept Sarah's bedroom exactly as it had been on September 12, 1968. Making the bed each morning with the same yellow bedspread, dusting the collection of ceramic horses on the windowsill, and ensuring that Sarah's homework assignments remained stacked neatly on her desk. The algebra problems that Sarah had completed the night before her disappearance stayed open to page 47, her pencil lying beside the notebook at the exact angle where she had placed it after finishing the last equation. In the first months after Sarah vanished, this preservation felt like hope. Margaret told herself that Sarah would return to find everything waiting for her, that maintaining normalcy was a form of faith that would somehow call her daughter home. But as 1968 became 1969 and then 1970, the unchanging room transformed from a shrine of hope into a monument to loss. Robert Henderson began sleeping in the guest room, unable to pass Sarah's door each night and see Margaret sitting on the edge of the bed, holding Sarah's favorite sweater and whispering conversations with a daughter who wasn't there to answer. The annual pilgrimage to Sheriff Walsh's office became Margaret's most sacred ritual. Every September 12th, she would dress in her best outfit, drive the 8 miles to the McLean County Sheriff's Department and file a new missing person report for Sarah Michelle Henderson. The law didn't require annual filings for missing persons cases, but Margaret had convinced herself that constant pressure was the only way to prevent Sarah's case from being forgotten. Walsh, and later his successor Sheriff James Miller, received these visits with patient compassion, even as the reports became increasingly detailed and somewhat detached from reality. By 1975, Margaret's reports included elaborate theories about Sarah's disappearance that she had developed through extensive correspondence with other families of missing children across the Midwest. She became convinced that a network of criminals was systematically abducting teenage girls from rural areas, transporting them across state lines for purposes she could never articulate but clearly feared. Her letters to the FBI grew more frequent and more desperate, filled with connections she had drawn between Sarah's case and missing person reports from Iowa, Indiana, and Wisconsin that shared only the most superficial similarities. The psychological toll on the Henderson family became evident to their rural community in ways that no one quite knew how to address. Robert Henderson, a man who had been known for his steady reliability and gentle humor, became increasingly withdrawn and began drinking heavily after finishing his daily farm work. Their marriage, which had been solid and affectionate before Sarah's disappearance, became a careful choreography of two people trying to grieve in the same house without acknowledging that their grief had taken incompatible forms. Margaret's obsession expanded beyond the annual reports to include maintaining detailed correspondence with psychics, private investigators who promised results for money the Hendersons couldn't afford, and amateur detectives who contacted her after reading about Sarah's case in true crime magazines. She converted Sarah's room into an informal command center, covering the walls with maps marked with pins indicating where other girls had disappeared, timelines written in her increasingly erratic handwriting, and photographs of men who'd been arrested for similar crimes in other states. The community's initial sympathy gradually gave way to uncomfortable avoidance. Margaret's behavior at church services became unpredictable, sometimes involving tearful outbursts during prayers for the sick, and other times manifesting as inappropriate laughter during serious moments when her mind had wandered to some memory of Sarah. The women's auxiliary stopped including her in social functions, not out of cruelty, but because her presence transformed every gathering into an occasion for discussing theories about Sarah's disappearance that had become increasingly disconnected from evidence or logic. Robert Henderson died of a heart attack in 1987, found by Margaret in the barn, where he had been working alone on equipment maintenance. The official cause was cardiac arrest, but everyone in Millbrook understood that Robert had been dying slowly for 19 years, worn down by grief and Margaret's refusal to accept that Sarah was never coming home. Margaret discovered his body at noon on a Tuesday, exactly 19 years, and 2 months after Sarah had failed to return from school on another Tuesday morning. Detective Patricia O'Brien discovered the forgotten evidence box on a humid Thursday afternoon in August 1995, 27 years after Sarah Henderson's disappearance. O'Brien had been assigned to conduct an inventory of the McLean County Courthouse basement storage areas as part of a county-wide effort to digitize old records and clear space for new filing systems. The basement stretched beneath the entire courthouse building, a maze of concrete-walled rooms that had accumulated decades of legal documents, evidence boxes, and administrative files that no one quite remembered how to categorize. The Henderson case file sat in a cardboard banker's box that had been misfiled in a section designated for civil court records rather than criminal investigations. The box itself showed signs of water damage from a pipe leak that had occurred sometime in the 1980s, leaving brown stains along the edges and a musty smell that indicated prolonged moisture exposure. O'Brien nearly overlooked it entirely, mistaking it for another container of property deed transfers or estate probate documents that filled most of the surrounding shelves. When O'Brien finally opened the box, she found herself looking at a case that predated her law enforcement career by nearly a decade. The original evidence inventory, typed on yellowed paper with a manual typewriter whose E key struck slightly higher than the other letters, listed 37 items collected during the initial investigation. Most were routine materials that had yielded no useful information. Soil samples from the roadside where Sarah's bicycle was found, photographs of tire tracks that proved too degraded to match, witness statements that had led nowhere productive. But buried beneath layers of routine evidence bags and faded photographs was something that made O'Brien pause in the stifling basement air. Evidence bag number 7 contained Sarah Henderson's blue cardigan sweater, the one she had been wearing when she left home on September 12, 1968. The sweater had been torn at the left shoulder, with the fabric separated along a seam in a way that suggested sudden, forceful contact rather than gradual wear. More importantly, the evidence bag also contained several smaller envelopes labeled unknown fiber samples and fabric fragments collected at scene. The fiber samples had been collected by FBI technician Robert Chen, whose meticulous evidence collection methods had been noted throughout the original case file. Chen had used tweezers to remove fibers from the torn section of Sarah's sweater that appeared inconsistent with the sweater's own material composition. Under the magnification available in 1968, these fibers appeared to be cotton-based fabric in a dark blue or black color, possibly from work clothing or heavy outerwear. But the technology to analyze these samples properly simply hadn't existed when they were collected. O'Brien found herself staring at evidence that had been waiting nearly 3 decades for forensic science to catch up with investigative theory. DNA analysis had become standard procedure in criminal investigations by 1995, but the techniques for extracting genetic material from fabric fibers were still evolving rapidly. The Illinois State Crime Laboratory had recently acquired equipment capable of analyzing microscopic biological samples that would have been useless to earlier forensic methods. The fabric fragments told a more complex story. Chen had collected these pieces from the ground near where Sarah's bicycle was discovered, some caught on fence wire and others embedded in the gravel shoulder of County Line 4. The fragments appeared to come from at least 2 different sources, pieces that matched Sarah's white school blouse and several pieces that clearly came from different garments entirely. One fragment, barely larger than a postage stamp, showed what appeared to be a small tear pattern with microscopic traces of what Chen had described as possible biological material. O'Brien carefully photographed each piece of evidence before resealing the containers according to updated chain of custody protocols. The basement storage had not been ideal for preserving biological evidence, but the cool, dry conditions had actually helped prevent the degradation that might have occurred in less controlled environments. She could feel the weight of possibility as she carried the box upstairs to her office, understanding that these forgotten fragments might contain the key to answering questions that had tormented the Henderson family for more than a quarter century. Michael Henderson was 8 years old when his sister Sarah disappeared, young enough that his memories of her were filtered through the lens of childhood hero worship rather than the complex understanding that comes with shared adolescence. By 2019, when their mother Margaret finally succumbed to the combination of emphysema and what the death certificate diplomatically termed complications of chronic grief, Michael had spent 51 years living in the shadow of a sister who had become more myth than memory in their family's daily existence. Margaret's death came on a February morning when the Illinois countryside was locked in the grip of a winter that had lasted since December, with no sign of yielding to spring. Michael found her in Sarah's bedroom, where she had taken to sleeping during her final months, surrounded by the accumulated evidence of 5 decades of obsessive investigation. The room had evolved from a preserved shrine into something resembling a conspiracy theorist's command center, with walls covered in maps, photographs, newspaper clippings, and handwritten timelines that traced connections between Sarah's disappearance and dozens of other missing person cases across the Midwest. The funeral was small, attended by the handful of Millbrook residents who remembered the Henderson family from before they became defined entirely by tragedy. Michael stood beside the grave in the Lutheran cemetery where his father Robert had been buried 32 years earlier, listening to Pastor Williams deliver a eulogy that struggled to find words for a woman whose life had effectively ended on the same September day that claimed her daughter. The pastor spoke about Margaret's devotion and persistence, carefully avoiding any direct reference to the mental deterioration that had made her final years a source of discomfort for the community that had once embraced her family. After the funeral, Michael faced the overwhelming task of sorting through Margaret's accumulated materials. The house had become a repository for every document, photograph, and piece of correspondence related to Sarah's case, organized according to a system that made sense only to Margaret's increasingly fragmented thinking. Boxes filled the basement, containing copies of police reports, letters to and from FBI agents, communications with psychics and private investigators, and detailed notes about television programs that had featured missing person cases with any superficial similarity to Sarah's disappearance. But buried within Margaret's obsessive documentation, Michael discovered evidence of genuine investigative work that had been dismissed or overlooked by law enforcement agencies, overwhelmed by her more erratic theories. Margaret had maintained correspondence with families of missing girls across Illinois, Indiana, and Iowa, creating a network of shared information that revealed patterns no single jurisdiction had been able to recognize. Her maps showed clusters of disappearances that occurred during specific time periods in rural areas served by similar highway routes, suggesting the possibility of a mobile perpetrator who had never been identified because the crimes crossed multiple jurisdictional boundaries. Michael had inherited his mother's determination, but possessed the emotional stability that 50 years of grief had gradually eroded in Margaret. He approached Sarah's case with the methodical mindset of someone who had spent his career in agricultural equipment sales, understanding that solving complex problems required systematic analysis rather than intuitive leaps. He began by digitizing Margaret's entire collection, scanning thousands of documents and photographs into a computer database that would allow him to search for patterns and connections that might have been invisible when scattered across physical files. The breakthrough came when Michael contacted Detective Patricia O'Brien, now retired but still consulting on cold cases for the Illinois State Police. O'Brien had kept the Henderson case file active in her mind even after leaving law enforcement, occasionally revisiting the evidence when new forensic techniques became available. When Michael explained his systematic approach to organizing his mother's research, O'Brien realized that the combination of Margaret's investigative work and modern DNA analysis might finally provide the answers that had eluded investigators For more than 50 years, Michael's persistence differed from his mother's in crucial ways. Where Margaret had been driven by desperate hope and increasingly irrational theories, Michael was motivated by a desire to honor both his sister's memory and his mother's lifelong dedication. He understood that solving Sarah's case wouldn't bring either of them back, but he also recognized that allowing the investigation to die with Margaret would mean that their suffering had served no purpose. If you've been following this decades-long search for truth, consider subscribing to see how new forensic methods are finally providing answers to questions that have haunted families like the Hendersons for generations. Detective Amy Rodriguez received the phone call from the Illinois State Crime Laboratory at 3:17 p.m. on November 15, 2023, 55 years and 2 months after Sarah Henderson had failed to arrive at school. Rodriguez had been working the Henderson case intermittently for 8 months, ever since Michael Henderson's persistent advocacy had convinced her supervisor to authorize the expensive genetic genealogy analysis that might finally identify the unknown DNA profile extracted from Sarah's torn sweater. The laboratory technician, Dr. Jennifer Walsh, spoke with the careful precision of someone who understood that her words would reshape decades of unanswered questions. The genetic material recovered from the fabric fragments had yielded a partial but usable DNA profile that had been run through the combined DNA index system with no matches. But the newer technique of forensic genetic genealogy, which compared crime scene DNA to publicly available genetic databases used by ancestry research companies, had produced something unprecedented in the Henderson case, a family tree that led to a specific individual. Rodriguez felt her pulse quicken as Dr. Walsh explained the methodology. The DNA profile had been uploaded to GED Match, a public database where people who had taken commercial ancestry tests could share their genetic information to find relatives. The system had identified several distant cousins whose family trees, when analyzed by genetic genealogist Caroline Mitchell, converged on a common set of ancestors in central Illinois during the 1800s. Mitchell had spent 6 weeks constructing detailed family trees for each branch, working backward through birth records, marriage certificates, and census data to identify living descendants who could have contributed the DNA found on Sarah's sweater. The family tree analysis had narrowed the possibilities to 3 men who would have been between 18 and 35 years old in 1968 and living within 50 miles of Millbrook. 2 of these men were still alive and had voluntarily provided DNA samples that eliminated them as matches. The third was Thomas James Carlisle, who had died of liver failure in 2018 at the age of 72. Carlisle's DNA profile, collected during a 2016 arrest for domestic violence, had been entered into CODIS posthumously when Illinois expanded its database inclusion criteria in 2019. Rodriguez stared at the case file that Dr. Walsh had transmitted electronically, reading details about a man who had lived his entire life within 2 counties of where Sarah Henderson disappeared. Thomas Carlisle had been born in 1946 in nearby Ford County, making him 22 years old when Sarah vanished. His criminal record showed a pattern of increasingly serious offenses that began with minor theft charges in his teens and escalated to assault and domestic violence convictions throughout his adult life. Most significantly, Carlisle had been arrested twice for what the reports termed unwanted contact with minors, though both cases had been dismissed due to insufficient evidence and reluctant witnesses. The address history in Carlisle's file revealed something that made Rodriguez's hands shake slightly as she turned the pages. In September 1968, Thomas Carlisle had been living on a family property located on rural Route 7, less than 3 miles from the intersection where Sarah's bicycle was found abandoned. The property, originally owned by his grandfather, Herman Carlisle, was a 40-acre farm that had been gradually subdivided and sold off as the family's agricultural operations declined through the 1960s. Thomas had inherited the main farmhouse and surrounding acreage when his grandfather died in 1967, giving him complete privacy and isolation during the exact time period when Sarah Henderson disappeared. Rodriguez immediately contacted Ford County Sheriff's Department to request all available records related to Thomas Carlisle and his property. What she learned made her understand why the original investigation had never identified him as a suspect. Carlisle had been questioned briefly in October 1968 as part of the routine canvassing of area residents, but the interview had been conducted by a single deputy who found nothing suspicious about the young man who claimed to have been working on farm equipment maintenance during the morning of September 12th. No follow-up investigation was conducted, and Carlisle's name appeared only once in the thousands of pages of documentation generated during the massive search effort. The investigation into Thomas Carlisle's background revealed a pattern of violence against women that had been hidden for decades behind the protective silence of small-town communities and the limitations of pre-digital record-keeping. Detective Rodriguez spent 3 weeks in November 2023 traveling between county courthouses, police departments, and newspaper archives across central Illinois, piecing together a criminal history that no single jurisdiction had been able to see in its entirety. Carlisle's first documented assault against a female occurred in 1969, less than a year after Sarah Henderson's disappearance. Lisa Morrison, then 19 years old and working as a waitress in the nearby town of Gibson City, had reported that a man matching Carlisle's description had followed her home from work on multiple occasions before attacking her in the parking lot of her apartment building. Morrison's description of her attacker included specific details about a scar on his left hand from a farming accident that matched medical records for Thomas Carlisle. But the investigation had been closed when Morrison suddenly moved to Chicago and refused to cooperate further with police. The pattern continued through the 1970s and 1980s with remarkable consistency. Rodriguez discovered reports from DeWitt County, McLean County, and Champaign County describing similar incidents. Young women who reported being stalked and attacked by a man who seemed to appear and disappear like a ghost in the rural areas between small towns. The attacks typically occurred along isolated roads during evening hours, and the perpetrator invariably fled when victims resisted or when other vehicles approached. Most disturbing was the age range of the victims. All were between 15 and 19 years old. All had blonde or light brown hair, similar to Sarah Henderson's, and all were traveling alone when they were targeted. Rodriguez's breakthrough came when she contacted Detective Frank Kowalski Jr., whose father had been the state police detective assigned to Sarah's original case. The younger Kowalski had inherited his father's case files when the elder detective died in 2009 and had maintained them in his basement as an unofficial cold case archive. Among these files was a folder labeled Similar Incidents, Unconfirmed Connection, that contained reports his father had collected but never formally investigated due to jurisdictional limitations and resource constraints. The folder contained detailed notes about Thomas Carlisle that had never been included in the official Henderson case file. Detective Frank Kowalski Sr. had become suspicious of Carlisle in 1971 when a pattern of attacks in the area led him to re-examine the list of men who had been questioned during the original investigation. Kowalski had conducted surveillance of Carlisle's property on several occasions and had documented observations about his behavior that suggested potential involvement in multiple crimes against young women. However, the surveillance had been unofficial and had never produced evidence sufficient for an arrest warrant. The most significant discovery came when Rodriguez obtained permission to search the Carlisle property, which had been inherited by Thomas's son, David, after his death in 2018. David Carlisle, who lived in Springfield and used the family property only for weekend hunting, granted permission for a complete search after learning about the DNA evidence connecting his father to Sarah Henderson's disappearance. He had always suspected that his father was capable of violence, having witnessed his brutal treatment of David's mother throughout his childhood, but had never imagined the scope of Thomas's crimes. The search of the Carlisle property began on December 4, 2023, using ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs that had not been available to investigators in 1968. The main house had been demolished by David Carlisle in 2020, but the foundation and surrounding grounds yielded evidence that painted a horrifying picture of Thomas Carlisle's activities. Buried beneath what had been the basement floor, searchers discovered a metal toolbox containing items that could only be described as trophies. Pieces of clothing, jewelry, and personal items that matched descriptions of belongings taken from multiple victims across several decades. Among these items was a small ceramic horse, part of a collection that Margaret Henderson had described to investigators as Sarah's most prized possessions. The horse matched photographs from Sarah's bedroom that had been taken during the original investigation, providing physical evidence that connected Thomas Carlisle not only to Sarah's DNA, but to her actual presence at his property. The discovery sent shockwaves through the investigative team and provided Michael Henderson with the first concrete proof that his sister's case was finally approaching resolution. The evidence against Thomas Carlisle became overwhelming during the winter of 2023, but the finality of his death 6 years earlier meant that the traditional concept of justice would never be fully realized. Detective Rodriguez found herself in the peculiar position of building an airtight case against a man who would never stand trial, never face his victims' families in court, and never be forced to account for the decades of suffering he had inflicted on the communities surrounding Millbrook. The forensic analysis of items recovered from Carlisle's property revealed connections to at least 7 other missing person cases spanning from 1969 to 1987. DNA evidence linked Carlisle definitively to 3 of these cases, while personal belongings found in his buried collection provided circumstantial evidence connecting him to several others. The ceramic horse from Sarah Henderson's collection was just one piece in a macabre treasure trove that included a high school class ring belonging to Jennifer Walsh, who had disappeared from Champaign County in 1974, and a distinctive silver bracelet that had belonged to Maria Santos, a 17-year-old who vanished while walking home from her job at a Bloomington restaurant in 1981. Rodriguez spent countless hours reviewing the original investigation files from these related cases, understanding now why the crimes had never been connected during the years when Carlisle was actively preying on young women. The jurisdictional boundaries that separated McLean County from Ford County, DeWitt County, and Champaign County had created investigative silos that prevented law enforcement agencies from recognizing the pattern of a single predator moving systematically through rural Illinois. Each case had been worked independently by dedicated investigators who lacked the communication networks and database systems that would have revealed the connections between Carlisle's crimes. The most devastating revelation came when Rodriguez discovered how close the original investigation had come to identifying Carlisle as Sarah Henderson's killer. In November 1968, Detective Frank Kowalski Sr. had obtained a warrant to search Carlisle's property based on witness reports that placed Carlisle's pickup truck in the vicinity of County Line 4 during the morning hours when Sarah disappeared. However, the search had been delayed for 2 weeks due to administrative complications, giving Carlisle sufficient time to remove any obvious evidence from his property. The search, when it finally occurred in December 1968, had focused on the house and immediate grounds, but had not extended to the areas where evidence was ultimately discovered in 2023. The ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dog capabilities that revealed Carlisle's buried cache of victims' belongings simply hadn't existed 55 years earlier. Additionally, the search warrant had been limited in scope, authorizing investigation only for evidence directly related to Sarah Henderson's disappearance, rather than the broader pattern of crimes that Carlisle had been committing. Rodriguez learned that Detective Kowalski had maintained unofficial surveillance of Carlisle through the early 1970s, documenting his movements and noting correlations between Carlisle's activities and the timing of attacks on young women in the region. Kowalski's personal notes, discovered in his son's basement archives, revealed a level of suspicion about Carlisle that had never been formally documented due to the limitations of evidence collection and legal procedures available at the time. The case files also revealed the tragic irony that Carlisle's criminal activity had actually escalated after he successfully avoided detection for Sarah's murder. The confidence gained from evading the massive investigation into Sarah's disappearance had apparently convinced Carlisle that he could continue attacking young women without consequence. His subsequent victims had paid the price for the investigative limitations that had allowed him to remain free after killing Sarah Henderson. By January 2024, Rodriguez had assembled sufficient evidence to close 8 separate cases that had remained unsolved for decades. The McLean County State's attorney formally declared that Thomas Carlisle would have been charged with first-degree murder in Sarah Henderson's death if he had been alive to face prosecution. Similar declarations were issued by prosecutors in the 4 other counties where Carlisle's crimes had occurred, providing official recognition of his guilt, even though traditional justice was impossible. Michael Henderson received the call from Detective Rodriguez on January 18, 2024, exactly 55 years and 4 months after his 8-year-old world had been shattered by his sister's disappearance. He was working in his home office in Springfield, reviewing agricultural equipment sales reports for the previous quarter, when his cell phone rang with the news that would finally close the longest chapter of his family's tormented history. Rodriguez's voice carried the weight of both triumph and tragedy as she explained that the Illinois State Police had officially closed Sarah Henderson's missing person case. The DNA evidence, combined with the discovery of Sarah's ceramic horse among Carlisle's hidden collection, provided conclusive proof that Thomas Carlisle had abducted and murdered Sarah on September 12, 1968. Rodriguez spoke carefully, understanding that the words she was choosing would become Michael's permanent memory of the moment when 55 years of questions finally received their answers. The news brought Michael a complex mixture of relief, grief, and anger that he struggled to process. Relief that the uncertainty was finally over, that his mother's lifelong obsession had been vindicated, and that Sarah's memory could be honored with truth rather than speculation. Grief for the sister he had lost, and for the parents who had died without ever knowing what happened to their daughter. Anger at the decades of suffering that could have been prevented if the original investigation had been able to connect the evidence that ultimately solved the case. Rodriguez arranged for Michael to view the evidence that had been recovered from Carlisle's property, understanding that seeing Sarah's ceramic horse would provide a tangible connection to his sister that he had been missing for more than 5 decades. The viewing took place in a conference room at the Illinois State Police headquarters in Springfield, where Michael sat across from Detective Rodriguez and carefully examined the small ceramic figure that had once stood on Sarah's bedroom windowsill. The horse was a Palomino mare, painted in shades of cream and gold that had faded slightly during its decades of burial, but remained recognizable as one of the collection that Sarah had treasured. Michael remembered the day his parents had given Sarah the complete set for her 14th birthday, and how she had arranged them carefully on her windowsill where the morning sunlight would make them seem to glow. Holding the recovered horse in his hands, Michael felt connected to his sister in a way that had been impossible when she existed only in memory and faded photographs. The formal closure of Sarah's case allowed Michael to finally make arrangements for a memorial service that had been impossible while her fate remained unknown. The service was held at the Millbrook Lutheran Church on March 15, 2024, exactly 55.5 years after Sarah's disappearance. The small sanctuary was filled with people who had known the Henderson family, participated in the original search efforts, or simply wanted to honor the memory of a girl whose story had become part of their community's history. Michael spoke during the service about the importance of persistence and the power of modern forensic science to provide answers to questions that had seemed forever unanswerable. He thanked Detective Rodriguez, the Illinois State Police, and the community members who had never stopped caring about Sarah's case. Most importantly, he announced the establishment of the Sarah Henderson Foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to supporting families of missing persons in rural communities and advocating for improved communication between law enforcement jurisdictions. The foundation would use the insurance settlement that Michael had received after proving Sarah's death to fund training programs for rural law enforcement agencies, providing them with access to modern forensic techniques and interjurisdictional communication systems that could prevent future cases from remaining unsolved for decades. Michael understood that he couldn't bring Sarah back, but he could ensure that her death would contribute to solving other families' mysteries and preventing other communities from experiencing the prolonged suffering that had defined his family's existence. As Michael stood beside Sarah's memorial marker in the Millbrook Lutheran Cemetery, where it was placed next to the graves of their parents, he felt the weight of 5 decades of uncertainty finally lifting from his shoulders. The questions that had consumed his mother's life and shadowed his own existence had been answered. Sarah could finally rest in peace, and the Henderson family's long vigil was over.